You know that feeling, right? The one where you just know instantly without thinking whether you like someone or if a situation feels off. It's your gut talking. The
Mm.
lightning fast, automatic part of your brain making snap judgments.
Yeah, totally. And then there's the opposite experience. Maybe you're trying to solve a complex problem at work or, deciding on a major purchase.
Right.
You're pulling out spreadsheets, listing pros and cons, analyzing every single angle. That's the slow, deliberate, really effortful work of your mind.
These two modes of thinking, they feel so distinct, don't they? And, well, for good reason. They map beautifully onto a model that's become incredibly influential in understanding how we think and decide.
The dual process model.
Exactly.
Okay.
Often simplified into System 1 and System 2. It's a framework that offers incredible insight into the machinery operating inside your head,
Hmm.
helping you understand everything from, like, why you fall for optical illusions to how you choose a retirement plan.
It's a powerful abstraction, really, isn't it? Popularized by thinkers like Daniel Kahneman. System one is your intuition, fast, automatic, operating below conscious awareness most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And system two is your reasoning, slow, effortful, logical, and it requires deliberate attention. This model has, profoundly shaped psychology, behavioral economics, even how we think about rationality itself.
Absolutely. It gives us a fantastic handle on so much of our cognitive landscape. Yeah. But here's where things get really interesting.
Hmm.
We've been digging into the first part of a fascinating manuscript.
Right.
A piece of writing that takes this well-established dual process model and, well, it dares to ask,
Mm-hmm.
is that the whole story? Could there be something else, maybe a third layer of cognitive processing beyond just the intuitive and the strictly logical?
And that's the core speculation the source material introduces, isn't it? It prompts us to consider if the two-system framework, while, yeah, immensely useful, might just be incomplete. Is there actually a logical or psychological case to be made for system three?
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack this initial section of the manuscript. We're going to revisit the bedrock systems 1 and 2 as presented here, introduce the concept of this proposed system 3, and then really get into the meat of the source's argument.
Which is?
The initial logical and psychological arguments, both for and maybe more critically, against its plausibility. Does it hold up?
And for you, the listener, this isn't just some abstract academic exercise. Exploring these layers of cognition, the ones we know well and the one being speculated about, it's like getting a more detailed map of your own inner workings.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It's about understanding not just how you arrive at conclusions, but what truly determines which conclusions you act on, and whether those actions are truly aligned with your deeper goals or values.
Exactly. It's about looking at that bridge between thinking and actually doing. So let's start by grounding ourselves in the familiar terrain, revisiting the dual process model and the characteristics of System 1 and System 2, as this manuscript first reminds us.
Okay, so as the source lays out, the dual process model is the widely accepted starting point. It provides this foundational abstraction for thinking about two different modes of processing information.
And at the heart of it are those two distinct characters, System 1.
Yes, system one. This is the fast one. The source defines it as automatic intuitive thinking. Think of it as your brain's highly efficient autopilot.
Autopilot. I like that analogy. How does that autopilot operate then?
Well, it operates with virtually no conscious control. You don't decide to engage system one. It just kind of runs in the background, constantly processing information.
Right.
The manuscript gives examples we can all relate to. Those snap judgments we make, sudden gut reactions, recognizing patterns instantly, understanding basic language. When you see a scary face, you flinch before you even consciously register scary.
Yeah, that's System 1.
That's system one at work. Its defining features are its speed and its automaticity. It's effortless and immediate.
So it's incredibly useful for navigating the world quickly, making rapid assessments without tying up our, limited cognitive resources. It's powerful, but as we know, it's also prone to certain biases or maybe jumping to conclusions sometimes.
Precisely. Its speed and its reliance on heuristics, those mental shortcuts make it really efficient, but also susceptible to systematic errors under certain conditions. Those biases Kahneman talked about.
Okay, it's the fast, automatic System 1.
Hmm.
Now, what about its more deliberate counterpart, System 2?
Right, system two. This is the slow one. The effortful, deliberate reasoning system. If system one is the autopilot, system two is the careful pilot taking manual control of the plane.
And that manual control implies a different kind of operation.
Yeah.
It feels different.
Absolutely. It involves effortful analysis. This is when you're actively concentrating, focusing your attention. Like, think about calculating a complex percentage in your head, or sitting down to logically evaluate arguments for and against a really difficult decision, like whether to change careers. It requires conscious cognitive resources. It actually feels like work.
And how does System 2 interact with System 1? Does it just take over?
Well, System 2 has the capacity to monitor and, crucially, if necessary, override the output of System 1. Because System 1 is prone to those biases we mentioned.
Yeah.
System 2 is essential for catching those errors, for slowing down, reflecting, and applying logic to arrive at a more accurate or, let's say, rational conclusion.
Okay.
When you encounter one of those tricky problems designed to trigger a misleading System 1 intuition, System 2 is what you use to pause, apply the rules, and find the correct answer. The source clearly highlights this contrast in effort. System 1 is low effort, almost zero effort. System 2 is high effort.
Got it. So System 1 gives us quick, intuitive responses, sometimes right, sometimes biased. System 2 is the conscious override, the logical analyzer that requires effort to correct System 1 or tackle complex problems it just can't handle on its own.
That sums it up pretty well. And the source emphasizes that this two-tiered view is a valuable and, importantly, well-supported abstraction in cognitive science and psychology. It's been incredibly successful in explaining a huge range of human behaviors and decision patterns.
And for a long time, it's really been the dominant way we think about these things. But this new manuscript we're exploring, it introduces this, well, intriguing speculation, the idea that maybe there's a gap, something beyond these two systems.
Yes, this is where the core concept of the source material really comes in. It proposes that some thinkers have begun to speculate about the existence of a System 3.
A third system. Okay, where would this fit in? Would it be like parallel to System 1 and 2 or somewhere else entirely?
The proposed relationship described in the source is that System 3 would kind of build on System 2's rational analysis. It's envisioned as operating at a higher level, taking the results of System 2's deliberate thought processes as its input.
Okay, so System 2 does the heavy lifting of analysis, the pros and cons list. What does this hypothetical System 3 supposedly do then? What's its job description?
The general idea presented in the manuscript is that System 3's core function would be to determine and then execute the best or most optimal course of action based on System 2's analysis.
Huh. So let's say System 2 analyzes 10 different job offers, right? Weighing salary, location, responsibilities. It does all that comparative work. Then System 3 steps in. Is that the idea?
That's basically the concept, yes. It's described in the source as a meta-decisional system.
Meta-decisional. Okay, let's unpack that term a bit. Meta meaning like operating on a higher level.
Exactly. So it's a system that makes decisions about the outputs of your existing decision systems, System 1 and System 2.
Okay, making decisions about decisions. Walk me through how that would actually work, according to the source.
The source explains that after System 2 has done its logical evaluation comparing those job offers, analyzing the risks of an investment, planning a complex project, System 3 would operate on that analysis. It would look at System 2's output and decide which of the rationally evaluated options is truly optimal, maybe in a broader sense.
And would this optimal decision just be like the most logical one that System 2 identified? Or could it involve more factors?
That's a key point. The source notes the possibility that this proposed third system might incorporate additional considerations beyond just System 2's pure logic.
Like what?
This could include factors like your overarching life values, maybe the specific context you're in that System 2 might have analyzed but not necessarily prioritized, or maybe integrating emotional insights that System 1 flagged but System 2 then processed rationally.
Interesting.
So it's not necessarily just picking the top item from System 2's ranked list. It might be selecting based on a more integrated, higher-level assessment of what best actually means for you in that situation.
Okay, it sounds like it's meant to bridge the gap between, say, cold logic and applied wisdom or something like that.
That's a good way to think about it. And crucially, according to this proposed idea in the source, System 3 wouldn't just decide on the optimal path. It would also ensure that this chosen optimal option is actually carried out in behavior.
Oh.
It's envisioned as the system responsible for translating the reasoned choice into committed action.
Okay, this connects directly back to that thinking versus doing point we touched on earlier. So, to use the simplified description the source offers, if System 2 is about the act of thinking and analyzing, System 3 would be about turning those thoughts, those reasoned conclusions, into wise or goal-aligned action. It's the executioner, in a way.
That's the concept, yes. It's the system that supposedly makes sure the sophisticated analysis of System 2 isn't just, left hanging, but actually results in effective behavior that aligns with your goals or what you've determined is optimal.
Now, it's really important, and the source makes this very clear, to state that this concept of a distinct System 3 is not part of Kahneman's original widely accepted dual process theory.
Absolutely not. Yeah, that's crucial. It's a later, much more speculative proposal.
It's something being discussed and explored by some researchers, not a universally agreed upon third system in the standard model we all learned about.
Sure.
Which brings us to the core questions this manuscript immediately raises about this whole idea. What are the big hurdles the source identifies right off the bat for System 3?
Well, the central questions posed are whether introducing a third cognitive tier is truly logically necessary to explain human behavior.
Do we need it?
Right. And is it scientifically supported by evidence that's distinct from systems 1 and 2? And critically, how would such a system 3 genuinely align and integrate with what we already know about the mechanisms of human cognition? Does it fit?
These questions are where the rubber meets the road, aren't they? Does
Yeah.
this concept actually earn its place? Or is it just adding complexity without explaining anything new? And this leads us directly into the heart of the debate presented in the source. The logical and psychological plausibility of the case for, and maybe more significantly, the case against System 3.
Right. And the source is fair. It starts by acknowledging why the idea of a system 3 can feel intuitively appealing, at least at first glance.
Okay, and what is that initial appeal? Why might someone even propose this in the first place?
Well, for one, it fits nicely into a sort of hierarchical view of cognition. You have the base level, that's System 1. The analytical layer above that is System 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then adding a third layer on top for, say, control or execution feels like a kind of natural progression, like a mind overseeing its own outputs. It gives a sense of neat structure.
And the source points out that human decision-making does often involve steps that seem to go beyond just the analysis phase, right? We don't just stop after figuring out the best option. We have to actually do it. So what concepts might proponents of System 3 try to link it to from existing cognitive science?
They might point to concepts like metacognitive oversight or executive control. These are already established terms in psychology. They refer to the processes that allow us to monitor our own thoughts, evaluate whether we're thinking effectively, maybe switch strategies if needed, inhibit impulses, or maintain focus on a goal.
Metacognitive oversight. That sounds kind of complex. Can you break that down a bit more simply for us?
Sure. Think of metacognition basically as thinking about thinking.
Yeah.
It's that part of your mind that steps back and asks, okay, am I approaching this problem the right way? Is my System 2 getting distracted here? Do I need to double check System 1's initial gut feeling?
Ah, okay. Like self-monitoring.
Exactly. And executive control is more about managing your cognitive resources, controlling your attention, planning steps, overriding automatic responses that aren't helpful in the moment.
Got it. So these are kind of like the conductor of the mental orchestra managing the different parts of your mind. And those functions, monitoring, control, strategy switching, they sound very much like what a System 3, designed for optimality and execution, might be supposed to do.
Precisely. Proponents could argue that these established functions, which are clearly crucial for effective behavior based on thought, could conceptually correspond to the role of a System 3. They are processes that operate on the outputs of System 1 and System 2.
Now, the source also mentions an interesting argument that some researchers use about System 2 itself potentially having internal layers. How does that fit in as a point in favor of System 3's plausibility?
Yeah, this is a fascinating nuance. Some cognitive scientists argue that the classical System 2, as described in the standard dual process model, might not actually be a single monolithic thing. They suggest it could already contain at least two layers, sort of, within it. One layer performs the core, effortful logical operations, crunching the numbers, applying the rules, comparing the features of those job offers we talked about.
The calculation part.
Right. And the other, potentially higher layer within System 2 is involved in deciding how and when to deploy that analytical power, which analyses to trust, and ultimately which System 2 derived conclusion to commit to.
Huh. So if System 2 already has this internal structure, where one part is doing the analysis and another part is kind of reasoning about the reasoning,
Then the argument goes, it's maybe not such a huge psychological leap to conceptually separate that higher control or selection layer and propose it as something distinct, maybe even call it a system 3.
Okay.
This internal layer idea is used to suggest that the idea of a cognitive process operating on the output of deliberation isn't totally foreign to our models of the mind. It makes distinguishing a third layer seem, perhaps, more psychologically defensible, especially if it relates to functions like reasoning about reasoning, as the source puts it.
Okay, so there's some intuitive hooks, right? And potential conceptual connections to existing ideas like metacognition and executive control, and even these arguments about System two's internal structure that lend some initial plausibility to the idea of a System 3.
Yes, that's pretty much the case for its initial plausibility, as presented in the source. It feels like it could fit, and we have related concepts floating around. But now, the source moves to the major challenge, the critical perspective.
And the main challenge seems to boil down to, does it actually exist as something distinct? Is it real?
Precisely. That's the core problem, and it's the reason the idea of a discrete system 3 is not part of the mainstream consensus in the way systems 1 and 2 are. It's the lack of clear evidence that it represents a cognitive system fundamentally different from the two we already have a good handle on.
So the central counter-argument, as the source outlines it, is that what's being proposed as System 3 might just be, well, System 2 doing its job.
That's the heart of the critique, yeah. Many psychologists and cognitive scientists view the process of taking a reasoned decision from System 2, committing to it, and then consciously executing it in behavior as being firmly within the domain of System 2 itself.
But why would they see execution as part of System 2? Isn't System 2 just about the thinking part, the analysis?
Well, from this perspective, executing a deliberate decision involves things like conscious oversight, effortful self-control, and goal-directed behavior. And those are precisely the characteristics we typically associate with System 2. Think about it. When you decide, using System 2, to resist eating that second cookie because you're on a diet, and then you actively use willpower to push the plate away, proponents of the two-system model would argue that the willpower and self-control involved are classic System 2 functions. It's the same system that analyzed the long-term consequences of eating the cookie that is now overriding the System 1 impulse and directing your actions.
So introducing a whole new system just for the final act of carrying out a System 2 decision feels like what? An unnecessary complication?
Exactly. It feels like an unnecessary complication to the existing framework. If System 2 is already defined by deliberation, effort, conscious control, and goal-directed behavior, why do you need a whole new system just to manage the final steps of that very process? It potentially adds theoretical layers without adding much explanatory power.
This ties directly into the condition the source mentions under which a System 3 would be logically defensible. It needs to clear a pretty high bar, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The source really stresses this point. For a System 3 to be logically justifiable, it must capture something distinctly new. It can't just be a mashup of System 1 and System 2 functions, or simply a relabeling of processes we already know about.
What does distinctly new mean in this context, practically speaking?
It means it needs to represent a cognitive function or process that is neither just the fast, associative, automatic processing of System 1, nor the slow, sequential, effortful, and controlled processing of System 2. It has to be a genuinely novel, integrative cognitive process.
Okay.
Something that explains how we think, decide, and act in a way that the current two-system model just cannot adequately account for.
And if it doesn't manage to do that, we get to the relabeling critique. This seems like a major stumbling block for the concept, based on the source.
It really is. The source highlights this as a key criticism. If a proposed System 3 isn't rigorously defined and doesn't map onto distinct processes, it runs the risk of simply relabeling aspects of personality or executive functions or even just complex interactions between System 1 and System 2 and then calling that collection a new system.
Can you give some examples of what the source means by this kind of relabeling?
Sure. The manuscript gives examples of traits or functions that some might try to fold into a definition of System 3, things like an individual's level of focus, or maybe their accumulated life experience, or their capacity for emotional regulation.
Okay, I can definitely see how focus, experience, and emotional regulation are hugely important for making good decisions and actually acting on them. Focus helps System 2 work effectively, right? Experience gives System 2 richer data to analyze. Emotional regulation can help System 2 override those strong System 1 impulses driven by feelings.
Exactly. They clearly influence the decision process and the likelihood of successful execution. But, as the source argues, simply lumping a collection of these influential factors or traits together and sticking a System 3 label on them doesn't provide evidence of a unified, distinct cognitive system.
Right.
A system operating at a fundamentally different level or using different mechanisms than the established two. It's kind of like saying your car's brakes, steering wheel, and engine are all separate driving systems instead of seeing them as components that the driver, maybe System 2 in this analogy, uses to operate the whole vehicle.
So just listing things that contribute to good decision-making or effective action isn't enough to actually define a new cognitive system. The psychological reality of System 3, if it's just based on this kind of relabeling, remains highly debatable.
Precisely. For System 3 to gain real credibility, the source emphasizes that it would need to map onto identifiable cognitive operations specific mental processes that are demonstrably separate from S1 and S2, or ideally onto distinct neural systems.
Like different brain areas.
Yeah, different brain areas or specific networks that perform these unique functions, demonstrably separable from those we associate with System 1, like the amygdala for rapid threat response, maybe, and System 2, like the prefrontal cortex for planning and control.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
It needs actual biological or process-based evidence, not just a list of desirable cognitive traits or factors that help things along.
That's the scientific standard, really. And the source synthesizes this tension very effectively. The concept of a System 3 has some conceptual appeal, sure, because it aligns with our intuitive sense of higher-level control, and it connects to established ideas like executive function. But this appeal is currently overshadowed by the significant lack of mainstream empirical evidence for a distinct third system and the major definitional challenge.
Right, the challenge of defining System 3 in a way that isn't just slicing up System 2 differently or relabeling other known psychological constructs,
Exactly.
which lead us to what feels like the decisive question, the ultimate challenge that any proposal for a System 3 must convincingly answer, according to this manuscript.
And the source poses it very directly and, I think, unequivocally. Why can't System 2, with its acknowledged capacity for normal executive control, do this on its own?
Yeah, that question cuts right to the core of the debate we've been exploring, doesn't it? If System 2 is already defined by its ability to analyze, deliberate, consciously oversee System 1,
Oh.
and exert control to align behavior with goals, why do we need another system just for the final steps of figuring out optimality and then executing the decision?
Exactly. The source anticipates this by exploring the idea, well, what if System 3 is really just System 2 plus action execution? Is that all it is?
And the immediate counterpoint is, well, isn't executing a chosen action already part of what System 2 does when it's engaged in rational deliberation and control?
Many theorists, probably most, would argue that yes, it absolutely is. When System 2 arrives at a reasoned conclusion, I really should save more money, or I should exercise today, or I need to finish this boring task before I play video games, the subsequent act of marshaling your cognitive resources, resisting distractions, and consciously directing your behavior to follow through on that conclusion. That's seen as the natural extension of System 2's deliberate, effortful, and control-oriented function.
So it's not like a handoff to a separate system. It's more like System 2 seeing the job through.
That's the view. It's System 2 exerting its defined capabilities. It's not just an analysis engine, it's also a control mechanism designed to regulate both thought and action in line with deliberate intentions.
So proponents of the standard dual process model, as presented in the source, would argue pretty strongly that System 2's existing role already includes monitoring those initial System 1 responses, overriding or adjusting them based on rational goals, and applying the conscious effort needed to align one's actual behavior with those deliberate goals.
That's precisely the view reinforced in the source, yes. System 2 does the thinking and manages the follow-through according to this perspective.
Which places a pretty significant burden of proof on anyone proposing a distinct System 3 then.
It absolutely does. The source concludes this section by emphasizing that for a System 3 concept to be really viable, it must clearly articulate what additional element it brings to the table. What specific function does it perform? What cognitive operation does it execute that is genuinely beyond System 2's documented capabilities for analysis, oversight, and goal-directed control?
And if it can't identify that unique contribution.
It struggles to find logical justification or empirical motivation, at least based on the current understanding presented in this part of the manuscript. That's the critical hurdle.
This first part of the manuscript really feels like it's meticulously setting the stage, doesn't it? Carefully laying out the existing landscape, the established players, System 1 and 2, and then introducing this potential new character, System 3, only to immediately subject it to intense scrutiny based on whether it truly earns its place on that stage.
Yeah.
Dense, but really essential for understanding the core challenge here.
It is dense, definitely. And the source itself acknowledges that the full manuscript is pretty extensive and probably designed for deliberate, effortful processing, very system two friendly.
Huh.
So presenting it in parts like this, doing this kind of deep dive, makes the information much more digestible and allows for the kind of focused discussion we're having.
Okay, so to quickly recap this first section we've explored today, we started by grounding ourselves in the familiar and, let's face it, really powerful framework of Systems 1, the fast, intuitive system, and System 2, the slow, deliberate one.
Right. We then introduced the intriguing speculation from this manuscript about a proposed System 3, conceptualized as building on System 2's analysis to determine and then execute the most optimal, goal-aligned actions, acting as a kind of meta-decisional system.
And we've spent a good chunk of time wrestling with the core tension presented in this first section. While the idea of a higher-level system for execution and optimality has some intuitive pull and, yeah, can be conceptually linked to known cognitive processes like executive control.
It faces massive challenges regarding its logical necessity and its psychological reality. Is it really needed? And is it really there as something separate?
The central defining question raised by the source is stark, isn't it? What exactly would a System 3 do that System 2 isn't already perfectly capable of handling, particularly when it comes to translating reasoned decisions into aligned actions? The onus is really on proponents to demonstrate a genuinely distinct contribution.
Absolutely.
And the manuscript doesn't just leave us hanging there with that question, does it? It gives us a preview of what's coming next, building directly on this challenge.
That's right. The preview indicates that part 2 of this manuscript will pivot from the abstract question of plausibility, can it exist,
Right.
to examining existing theoretical proposals that are already out there for tripartite or third mind models.
So other researchers have actually proposed ideas that go beyond the standard two systems. It's not just this manuscript.
Oh, yeah. The source mentions specific examples like Keith Stanovich's concept of a reflective mind, and also other models that try to incorporate elements like social norms or imagination as potential higher-level processes guiding our behavior.
Okay. And the goal of examining these existing proposals in part 2, what's the aim?
The goal, as the source describes it, is basically to see how closely these pre-existing third mind ideas measure up to the criteria and challenges raised right here in part 1.
So do any of them convincingly describe what could be called a bona fide System 3?
Exactly. One that represents a truly distinct, novel, and integrative cognitive process beyond Systems 1 and 2. And crucially, one that isn't simply relabeling existing stuff or adding unnecessary complexity. That's the test.
That sounds like part 2. We'll take the abstract requirements we've just spent all this time discussing and apply them like a filter, or maybe a checklist, to these existing theories. It'll be about seeing if anyone has actually managed to define this elusive third layer in a way that stands up to the kind of scrutiny laid out here.
Precisely. It's the next logical step in the investigation, moving from the conceptual possibility and its inherent challenges to evaluating concrete proposals against that very backdrop.
Okay. So we've taken a pretty deep dive today into the hypothesis of a third cognitive system. We've walked through the familiar ground of System 1's rapid intuition and System 2's deliberate reasoning, and then ventured into the, well, quite speculative territory of a proposed System 3.
A system intended to bridge that gap between thought and action by determining and executing optimal choices.
And we've grappled with the significant skepticism presented in the source material, the argument that what's being proposed as System 3 might simply be System 2 fulfilling its known role of conscious control and goal-directed behavior.
And the strong demand for clear evidence of a distinct cognitive mechanism, not just relabeling.
It leaves us with that powerful question hanging in the air from the source. What, truly, would a System 3 add to our understanding of cognition that System 2 isn't already providing, especially when we think about turning our best-laid plans into actual reality?
Exactly. It forces us to consider what might explain that frustrating gap we all experience sometimes between knowing the rational thing to do, that's your System 2 analysis, and actually doing it consistently and effectively. The execution part may be proposed for System 3.
And maybe, just maybe, the very struggle scientists seem to be having in defining this hypothetical System 3, improving its distinct existence. Maybe that struggle actually tells us something profound about the nature of that gap itself. Well, maybe it reveals the intricate, perhaps messy reality of translating reasoned thought into consistent, intentional behavior. Maybe it suggests it's not a simple handoff to some separate, neat System 3, but a really complex function within our existing cognitive architecture, maybe mostly within System 2 that we're still working to fully understand.
That's a really interesting thought. It certainly highlights the complexity of things like executive function and self-control processes that are absolutely critical for aligning behavior with System 2's output. And perhaps it reveals the inherent limits or the sheer effortfulness involved in System 2 itself, rather than definitively pointing to a missing third system.
It definitely makes you think about your own moments of, say, willpower failure, or maybe times you successfully stuck to a really difficult plan. Are those experiences evidence of some distinct system clicking into gear, or just the result of the push and pull within the two systems we already understand fairly well?
It's a truly compelling question to carry forward as we wait for part two of this analysis.
Keep thinking about those layers of your own mind, how you make decisions, and especially how your thoughts manage or sometimes fail to translate into action.